Thanks, everybody. This is a wonderful event, wonderful atmosphere. I've never been in a speaking environment where cheers just spontaneously emerge. So I'm just going to pretend they're all for me, and that's just going to be cool. So today I'm thrilled to talk with you about this idea of using the passive voice in public discourse. And what that really gets to the heart of isn't so much about the passive voice specifically, as it is very strategic and intentional uses of language in the way that we communicate and the messages that we choose to express. When you think about a debate or any other kind of public communication, it's all done with the idea of expressing a certain message. And when we're expressing a message, as I will tell my students, you're building something that you're trying to say. And when you build a certain message or a certain statement, you're doing so with certain linguistic choices, certain language tools. And one language tool that's used a great deal in political communication, as well as in all other kinds of public communication, is the passive voice. When you think about the passive voice, it gets hated on a lot. There are a lot of detractors on it. And so the question that can really govern our conversation together about this topic is, why? What is up with that? Is the passive voice rightfully vilified? Is it just bad writing? Is it bad communication? And if so, why is it used so much? And if we're using it all the time, then are we just using it? Mistakes were made, and I made mistakes was in 1920. That was also the time when there were the most published examples of mistakes were made, not just in comparison to I made mistakes, but in general. The difference now, his measurement goes through 2000. So the difference in 2000 is the same as in 1900. And 1920 and 1940 both represent the years when there was the largest published use of mistakes were made and the largest differential between mistakes were made and I made mistakes. So as that particular researcher, Baden Unson, says, people have been covering themselves for a great deal of time with that peaking somewhere between U.S. Prohibition and the Great Depression. So kind of an interesting take on that in a way that, for me at least, was a bit counterintuitive when I might think, oh, well, this is probably used a whole bunch now. In reality, the differential is not that great, and the amount that it's used, published examples of mistakes were made now, is about the same as it was in 1900, as is the differential between the two phrases. So pretty fascinating, at least to my mind, take on the differences between those phrases, and something of a counterintuitive way to consider it. Now, in addition to using the passive voice to avoid ownership in sentences like that, there are other strategic uses as well. One might be when you want to emphasize the thing on which an action was done, what would be the direct object of an active voice sentence, rather than the thing performing the action. You'll hear things like this in the regular news, regular media communication, things like the Super Bowl location has been announced. If you wanted to put that into the active voice, you could say something like the NFL or the NFL's commissioner announced the Super Bowl location. However, most likely the reason that sentence is in the passive voice is the fact that it was the Super Bowl location is more important than the person doing the announcing, which is why we would use that particular construction. Other instances are recently heard on a sports media outlet that 3 grand slams were hit in yesterday's Red Sox game. So in that statement, more of the focus is on 3 grand slams being hit than it is who hit them, and the focus then not becomes on the particular batters, but the fact that collectively these 3 hits were all conducted. There's an example that I'll show my students when looking at how these are used purposefully in literature. In a book about Billy the Kid, there's a sentence, Alexander McSween was shot down at the door. The context for that is that Alexander McSween was a lawyer during the time of Billy the Kid and a prominent figure, and in the context of one of the very large Wild West stereotypical gunfights, he was shot down at a door. That sentence puts more focus on Alexander McSween, the person who was shot, than it does who did the shooting. It could be because who did the shooting wasn't a particularly noteworthy character in the scheme of things. It could be because, with this being a Wild West gunfight, that entity wasn't known. And the author doesn't elaborate, so doesn't tell us. But when you look at a sentence like that, it definitely puts more focus on the person on whom an action was performed than it does the entity performing that particular action. So when you watch tonight's debate and when you think about this concept used in public discourse in general, some things you can think about. If during tonight's debate conversation you hear a passive voice statement, ask yourself, who is the agent in that statement? Can we even tell? And if we can tell, why is the speaker trying to de-emphasize that agent? What is it strategically that was done? What's the rationale behind that? And then as a follow-up, what you can do in your mind to try to really get to the heart of that statement and understand the importance of it being used in the passive voice is to try to turn it into an active voice sentence and think about how those two sentences are different. What's emphasized in the active voice one, what is focused on that otherwise wouldn't be. So with that, I will invite any of your questions or comments, and I thank you very much. Last night. You don't have to say who did it. You can use it just as it is. Now, some especially highly publicized and high-profile examples of the passive voice, one that is frequently referred to is one by Ronald Reagan, and I have a Bill Clinton one right after it to provide that bipartisan atmosphere. But Ronald Reagan in 1987, in reference to the Iran-Contra affair, said this in a strategic use of the passive voice, specifically using the passive voice construction, mistakes were made, which you'll hear in all of these examples that I'll share with you. And certainly it was not wrong